We're back. We have some technical challenges. Now, we have technical challenges because of the causality.
That's right.
Of things. And
It's all collective karma.
not only our collective karma, but the little glitches in the sort of circuitry of this computer and in the connection of the
So many things.
so many things. Were all the elements to exist inherently, there would be no possibility of any kind of evolution, change, etc. We wouldn't have any problems, but we wouldn't have anything that could have problems.
We would be talking.
So, thus Nagarjuna, the protector, holds that one must seek emptiness of intrinsic existence and the middle way on the very basis of the teachings of cause and effect. That is, the production and cessation of specific effects in dependence upon specific causes and conditions. The 24th chapter of Nagarjuna's fundamental treatise says, that which arises dependently we explain as emptiness. This emptiness is dependent designation. This is the middle way. Because there is no phenomenon that is not a dependent arising, there is no phenomenon that is not empty. Thus, Nagarjuna says that dependent arisings are necessarily empty of intrinsic existence. Do not turn this statement on its head by claiming that what is produced in dependence on causes and conditions must intrinsically exist. So he's blasting those who claim that the difference between the rope and the snake is that the rope is an intrinsically existent rope and the snake is an intrinsically existent snake. It is there, that is why the rope cannot bite one and the snake can. Okay. So if you pick him up and pet him, he will be happy. He'll purr.
No, he'll bite.
No, he won't. So, thus, so similarly, Nagarjuna's refutation of objection says, for whomever emptiness makes sense, everything makes sense. For whomever emptiness makes no sense, nothing makes any sense. I bow down to the Buddha, the unequaled supreme teacher, who taught that emptiness, dependent arising, and the middle way hold a single meaning. Also, Nagarjuna 70 stanzas on emptiness says, the unequal Tathagata taught that because all things are empty of intrinsic existence, things are dependent arisings. So it is due to things being empty of intrinsic existence that they can arise, that they are dependent arisings. So dependent arisings has these two sides, dependent and arising. Dependent is the causal or the causal aspect of the phrase, and arising means that out of that dependence, something will actually appear. Also, Nagarjuna 60 stanzas on reasoning says, those who cling to the self or to the world as though these were not contingent are captivated by extreme views of permanence and impermanence. Those who claim that dependent things exist in reality, how can they avoid the fallacies of permanence and so forth? Those who hold that contingent things like a moon reflected in water are neither real nor unreal, they are not captivated by such wrong views. Also, Nagarjuna's praise of the transcendent one, says, logicians claim that suffering is produced from itself or from something other or from both of them or without a cause. You said it arises dependently. You hold that whatever arises dependently is empty. There is nothing to match your roar. Things do not exist on their own. Thus, Nagarjuna says that it is precisely because of being dependent arisings that phenomena are empty of intrinsic existence. This explanation that dependent arising is the meaning of emptiness, that is to say, the absence of intrinsic existence, is the unique system of Nagarjuna, the protector. Therefore, dependent arising does not mean accepting emptiness, the absence of intrinsic existence for oneself as a madhyamika, while leaving teachings on dependent arising, arisen cause and effect to others because one is uncomfortable with having them in one's own system. Nagarjuna's statement in Fundamental Treatise, for those to whom emptiness makes sense, means that all of the dependent arisings of cyclic existence and nirvana are admissible, that is to say, work, in a system that teaches the absence of intrinsic existence. In other words, everything, all the mechanics of cyclic existence and of nirvana are possible due to the absence of intrinsic existence. So, Tsongkhapa really emphasizes this idea that absence of intrinsic existence means is the dependent arising. That dependent arising, that the existence is possible to because of not existing inherently. So the next chapter, dependent arising and emptiness. How is it that all of cyclic existence and nirvana is possible in a system that asserts emptiness? As I will explain below, proponents of the view that all things are empty of intrinsic existence argue that it is possible by reason of things arising in dependence on causes and conditions. So I will explain below. Proponents of the view that all things are empty of intrinsic existence argue that this is possible by reason of things arising in dependence on causes and conditions. So this is the view that we've just been presented with. This being the case, dependent arising is tenable within emptiness of intrinsic existence. And when dependent arising is tenable, suffering is also tenable. For suffering may be attributed only to what arises in dependence on causes and conditions. It cannot be attributed to what does not arise dependently. So the suffering that we experience is due to causes, and the causal and the sort of quality of our suffering, given that it is causal, our suffering does not exist inherently. If our suffering does not exist inherently, we can change the situation of suffering. If we remove the cause, the suffering will not arise. When true suffering exists, then the origins from which it arises, the cessation that is the stopping of that suffering, and the paths leading to those cessations are tenable. Thus, all four truths, the Four Noble Truths that the Buddha first taught, exist. When the four truths exist, then it is possible to understand, to eliminate, and to actualize the first three truths respectively. And it is possible to cultivate true paths. When such a practice exists, when such practices exist, then everything, the three jewels and so forth, is tenable. So if if there is a possibility of the existence of suffering which is caused, cessation of suffering which is possible due to the fact that that suffering does not exist inherently but is dependent, by removing the causes of suffering, you can bring about the cessation, and you do so by implementing the paths that lead to the cessation. And it is because of the possibility of the Four Noble Truths that you can bring about, that you can engage in the path, and that is the Sangha, the practitioners who are working at engaging in the implementation of the teaching, which is the Dharma, by which you can attain Buddhahood. So the existence of the three noble, the three jewels, the Buddha, the Dharma, the Sangha, they are possible due to the fact that nothing exists inherently, and that the Four Noble Truths are therefore or thereby possible. For those to whom this emptiness of intrinsic existence of all things makes sense, everything that has been mentioned also makes sense. This is Chandrakirti in his clear words. Why? Because when we call dependent arising emptiness, thus dependent arising makes sense in a system in which emptiness makes sense. And the Four Noble Truths are reasonable for those to whom dependent arising makes sense. Why? Because only what arises dependently can be suffering, not what does not arise dependently. Since what arises dependently lacks intrinsic nature, it is empty. Again, it is empty means it is empty of intrinsic existence. Lacks intrinsic nature means it is empty of intrinsic existence. Once there is suffering, then the origins of suffering, the cessation of suffering, and the paths leading to the cessation of suffering also make sense. Therefore, thorough understanding of suffering, elimination of origins, actualization of cessation, and cultivation of paths also makes sense. Here, makes sense means is possible, works, tenable. When there is thorough understanding, etc., of the truth and suffering, etc., then it makes sense that there will be spiritual results. Once there are results, then it makes sense that there are people who have achieved those results. This, in turn, implies the possibility of people who are approaching those results. So the people who have achieved those results would be the Buddhas. Those who are approaching those results would be the Sangha. Once there are people who are approaching and achieving those results, then the community is possible. The community is the Sangha. When the Noble Truths exist, then the sublime teaching also makes sense, the Dharma. And when the sublime teaching and community exist, then the Buddhas are possible as well. Therefore, the three jewels also make sense. All profound knowledge of everything mundane and supramundane makes sense. Proper and improper conduct, the result of that happy and miserable rebirth, and all worldly conventions makes sense as well. Therefore, in that way, Nagarjuna says, for those to whom emptiness makes sense, everything makes sense. If emptiness did not make sense, then dependent arising would not exist. And so nothing would make sense. Therefore, I hope this is clear. Therefore, you should understand that what makes sense and what does not make sense here refers to whether those things exist. As cited earlier, an objection by essentialists appeared in Nagarjuna's refutation of objections. If all things are completely without intrinsic nature, then your words also lack intrinsic nature and thus cannot refute intrinsic existence. Now, this is sort of an over negation. Um, if you say that if things do not exist intrinsically, they cannot exist at all, then words do not exist and don't have the power to express what we're talking about.
No functionality.
No functionality.
It's another one.
The Master Nagarjuna clearly answers that functionality is tenable within the context of the absence of intrinsic existence. The refutation of objects of Nagarjuna states, we propound that the dependent arising of things is called emptiness. That which arises dependently has no intrinsic nature. Also, Nagarjuna's own commentary on the refutation of objections here says, failing to comprehend the emptiness of things, you essentialists look for something to criticize and argue against the Madhyamika, saying your words lack intrinsic nature and therefore cannot refute the intrinsic existence of things. Here in Madhyamika, the dependent arising of things is emptiness. Why? Because they lack intrinsic nature. Those things that arise dependently are not associated with intrinsic nature because they lack intrinsic nature. Why? Because they rely on causes and conditions. So if something relies on causes and conditions, it can't exist intrinsically. If things had intrinsic nature, then they would exist even without causes and conditions. Since such is not the case, they lack intrinsic nature. Therefore, we speak of them as empty. Similarly, my words are also dependent arisings and therefore are without intrinsic nature. Because they lack intrinsic nature, it is reasonable to say that they are empty. Because things such as pots and cloths are dependent arisings, they are empty of intrinsic nature. Yet a pot can receive and hold honey, water, and soup. A cloth can protect one from the cold, wind, and sun. And so it is with my words. Because they are dependent arisings, they lack intrinsic nature. It says yet here, but I would even say hence. They are fully capable of establishing that things lack intrinsic existence. Therefore, it is inappropriate for you to give the argument. Because your words lack intrinsic existence, it is not tenable that they refute the intrinsic existence of all things. Thus, Nagarjuna speaks very clearly about the pervasion that whatever relies on causes and conditions lacks intrinsic nature, and the counter pervasion that whatever has intrinsic nature does not rely on causes and conditions. He very clearly says that words without intrinsic nature can carry out refutations and proofs. It is even necessary to point out that dependent arising, the production and cessation of afflicted and pure phenomena in dependence on causes and conditions, is located right together with the absence of intrinsic existence. Wait, this is a question? Sorry, it's a question. Is it even necessary to point out that dependent arising, the production and cessation of afflicted and pure phenomena in dependence on causes and conditions, is located right together with the absence of intrinsic existence? Dependent arising is the best reason to use in order to know the absence of intrinsic existence. You should be aware that only the Madhyamika experts have this unique approach. If you hold that dependent production and dependent cessation would have to be essentially existent, intrinsically existent, and you use the arguments against intrinsic existence to refute the dependent arising of production and cessation, then those arguments, like God transformed into a demon, will be a tremendous obstacle to finding an accurate understanding of Madhyamika. So if you actually can use any arguments against intrinsic let me just read it over for. If you hold that dependent production and dependent cessation would have to be essentially existent, and you use the argument against intrinsic existence to refute the dependent arising of production and cessation, then those arguments will be a tremendous obstacle to finding an accurate understanding of Madhyamika. In that case, when you develop a sense of certainty that phenomena lack even a particle of essential or intrinsic nature, you will then have no basis for developing certain knowledge of the relationship between cause and effect within your own system. You will have to posit those as others see them, etc. Or if you do develop a sense of certainty about cause and effect within your own system, then it will be impossible for your system to foster certain knowledge of the absence of intrinsic existence. You will have to find some other way to construe what the Buddha meant in speaking of the absence of intrinsic existence. If this is the case, then you must understand that you have not yet found the Madhyamika view. So if we pare all this down, in understanding causality, dependent arising, if we really see it as the sort of pure mechanics of, let's say, the workings of an old mechanical clock, that were any part of the clock, or were the clock altogether to be in some way fixed or inherently there, as opposed to operating as a result of the way in which the parts all work together, there would be no possibility of the clock working. The whole nature of this timepiece would be blocked by imposing a fixedness that would contradict the possibility of the sort of causal, the parts that have to work in order for a timepiece to work.
It wouldn't be telling time. It wouldn't be called a timepiece then. Logic. It's not telling time. It was just not. Yeah, it's stuck, static, whatever the word is, frozen.
So there's a purity about this that Tsongkhapa is presenting, and he's presenting the arguments that contradict this purity, and he's showing that these improper interpretations of the Madhyamika view block the whole point of the Madhyamika view, the essence of the Madhyamika view. And he's presenting one argument after another, and there will be more. What will help you find the right view? And this is rather beautiful, because he's bringing in the the causes that will help remove our reticence to accept the simple purity of the right view. As a basis, you should be pure in upholding your ethical commitments. So ethical behavior will help us recognize the purity of the view of dependent arising and emptiness of inherent existence. Then strive in many ways to accumulate the collections of merit and wisdom and clear away obscurations. So striving in many ways to accumulate the merit, generosity, ethics, patience, all of these practices. We must remember that this text is written from the point of view of the Mahayana practitioner who is engaging in these practices with the aspiration to attain full enlightenment for the sake of all sentient beings. And therefore, in addition to engaging in this insight into the ultimate view, the practitioner is engaging in the other 5 of the 6 perfections: the perfection of generosity and ethics and patience and perseverance and concentration.
Would you say that these are precepts for understanding emptiness? These 5 lines? Probably more, but
Which 5 lines?
what will help you find that as a baby? You should uphold your ethics, strive to get merit, and rely on the learned. Those 3 principles. Yeah, was a little kind-hearted advice. Looks like.
Yeah, yes, it's very touching.
It is.
Strive in many ways to accumulate a collection of merit and wisdom and clear away obscurations. Rely on the learned, a learned teacher, making effort to study and to reflect upon their instructions.
That's how the novel was.
Since certainty about appearances and certainty about emptiness almost never develop together. Now, this is the 2 things. You have the appearances, the phenomena, and then you have their emptiness of inherent existence. And it's very rare that we can actually apply the concept of dependent arising or emptiness of inherent existence to the phenomena that appear. It is extremely difficult to find the Madhyamika view. This is what Nagarjuna meant in the 24th chapter of the Fundamental Treatise. Therefore, knowing that those of limited intelligence would have difficulty understanding the depths of this teaching, the mind of the sage turned away from giving this teaching. So, the Buddha, upon having attained enlightenment, realized that there was no one who would understand what he had realized, and he therefore remained silent. Okay, we shall stop here. And we shall...
Darren, you have names? No names.
We shall end. I should say that you will find among the prayers a prayer for a quick rebirth.
The victims of the gas blast that happened in what is the country called near Armenia?
Azerbaijan.
Thank you. Sorry. Yes.
All the victims of the blast that took
Iraq
place
has
in
Iraq, the wedding fire in Iraq killed 112
That's
people.
Well,
something different. Yeah.
Here. In other words,
There's so many.
as we recite the Sutra of the Recollection of the Noble Three Jewels, we recite it praying that whoever may be reborn in a completely pure realm. Think of those whom you wish to pray for. We recite the Sutra of the Recollection of the Noble Three Jewels. I prostrate to the Omniscient One. Thus the Buddha, Bhagavat, Tathagata, Arhat, Samyak Sambuddha, the learned and virtuous one, the Sugata, the knower of the world, the charioteer and tamer of beings, the unsurpassable one, the teacher of devas and humans is the Buddha Bhagavat. The Tathagata is in accord with all merit. He does not waste the roots of virtue. He is completely ornamented with all patience. He is the basis of the treasures of merit. He is adorned with the minor marks. He blossoms with the flowers of the major marks. His activity is timely and appropriate. Seeing him, he is without disharmony. He brings true joy to those along with faith. His knowledge cannot be overpowered. His strength cannot be challenged. He is the teacher of all sentient beings. He is the father of bodhisattvas. He is the king of noble ones. He is the guide of those who journey to the city of nirvana. He possesses immeasurable wisdom. He possesses inconceivable confidence. His speech is completely pure. His melody is pleasing. One never has enough of seeing him. His form is incomparable. He is not stained by the realm of desire. He is not stained by the realm of form. He is not affected by the formless realm. He is completely liberated from suffering. He is completely and utterly liberated from the skandhas. He is not possessed with dhatus. His ayatanas are controlled. He has completely cut the knots. He is completely liberated from extreme torment. He is liberated from craving. He has crossed over the river. He is perfected in all the wisdoms. He abides in the wisdom of the Buddha Bhagavats who arise in the past, present, and future. He does not abide in nirvana. He abides in the ultimate perfection. He dwells on the bhumi where he sees all sentient beings. All these are the perfect virtues of the greatness of the Buddha Bhagavat. The holy Dharma is good at the beginning, good in the middle, and good at the end. Its meaning is excellent. Its words are excellent. It is uncorrupted. It is completely perfect and completely pure. It completely purifies. The Bhagavat teaches the Dharma well. It brings complete vision. It is free from sickness. It is always timely. It directs one further. Seeing it fulfills one's purpose. It brings discriminating insight for the wise. The Dharma which is taught by the Bhagavat is revealed properly in the Vinaya. It is renunciation. It causes one to arrive at perfect enlightenment. It is without contradiction. It is pithy. It is trustworthy and puts an end to the journey. As for the Sangha of the great Jnana, they enter completely, they enter insightfully, they enter straightforwardly, they enter harmoniously. They are worthy of veneration with joined palms. They are worthy of receiving prostration. They are a field of glorious merit. They are completely capable of receiving all gifts. They are an object of generosity. They are a great object of complete generosity. The protector who possesses great kindness, the omniscient teacher, the basis of oceans of merit and virtue, I prostrate to the Tathagata. Pure, the cause of freedom from passion, virtuous, liberated from the lower realms. This alone is the supreme ultimate truth. I prostrate to the Dharma of which peace. Having been liberated, they show the path of liberation. They are fully dedicated to the disciplines. They are a holy field of merit and possess virtue. I prostrate to the Sangha. I prostrate to the Buddha, the leader. I prostrate to the Dharma, the protector. I prostrate to the Sangha, the community. I prostrate respectfully and always to these three. The Buddha's virtues are inconceivable. The Dharma's virtues are inconceivable. The Sangha's virtues are inconceivable. Having faith in these inconceivable, therefore their fruitions are inconceivable. May they be born in a completely pure realm. So, within the prayers that are available on the website, there is the prayer for the return of Chungla Rinpoche, composed by His Holiness the Dalai Lama. the prayer for a swift return. There are also the 8 verses on training the mind. There is also the prayer for the flourishing of Je Tsongkhapa's teachings. So please feel free to recite those on your own if you wish to. So